LBJ, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, by Roger Stone, who gave a speech at the Barnes & Noble bookstore in Tysons Corner Shopping Mall in Virginia. Roger Stone has been touring the nation to give a talk about his new book and sign copies. Roger has been an assistant and advisor to Presidents Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. Robert has debated Senator Arlen Specter about his magic bullet theory and outlines reasons that Lyndon Baynes Johnson had for being a main organizer of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy to become president himself.
Strategist and lobbyist, but he is also the man credited with taking down New York Governor Eliot Spitzer. He has been involved in politics since his teenage and college years. He served as a senior staffer in 8 national Republican presidential campaigns, including those of Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. Stone is also credited with the destruction of the National Reform Party and the shutdown of the 2000 recount that made George W. Bush president. In 2012, Stone joined the Libertarian Party. Aside from politics, he's also known for his personal style and writes the annual 10 Best and Worst Dressed Men and Women in the World for the Huffington Post, while serving as men's fashion editor for the Daily Caller. The research in Roger's new book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ, has been called bombshell new evidence by the National Enquirer. He is here today to tell us who the mastermind was behind America's biggest cover-up, the JFK assassination. Please join me in welcoming Roger Stone.
Thank you. For my first number, thank you very much for coming today. This is the very first book signing at a Barnes & Noble in our national tour. We go from here to Paramus, New Jersey, from there to Santa Monica, California, from there to Dallas, Texas, where I have a signing on November 22nd, 2013, which is the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination. This is a book that I started working on really 10 years ago. I believed ever since 1964, when I read a book called A Texan Looks at Lyndon, which was one of the seminal works regarding the epic corruption and psychopathic personality of Lyndon Johnson, that Johnson had a unique motive, means, and opportunity to kill JFK. People lose sight of the fact that in November of 1963, Lyndon Johnson was a man staring into the abyss. The Bobby Baker scandal was being investigated by the United States Senate, with hearings opening that very day. The Billy Sol Estes scandal. Billy Sol Estes was a flamboyant Texas wheeler dealer who had been in business with Johnson, had gotten enormous fraudulent federal contracts. The Justice Department was investigating that. At the time of the assassination, there were 9 full-time Time Life investigative reporters digging through records, financial records in Texas, and Johnson knew that an expose on his finances and his wheeling and dealing and his corruption was slated for the Saturday after the assassination. I have sought in this book to build on the work of so many others, and they should be mentioned. Barr McClellan wrote a terrific book, Blood and Power. Philip Nelson wrote a terrific book, LBJ, the Mastermind of the JFK Assassination. Craig Serbel wrote a terrific book called The Texas Connection. I've tried to build on all that. A lot of people, it's interesting to me, they criticize my book before they've read it. There's nothing exculpatory about the CIA here, or about the mob, or Texas Oil. I think they're all elements of a plot to kill John F. Kennedy, and Johnson has an indelible tie to each of them. He is the appropriator. He is on the original committee that forms the CIA. He is taking care of the CIA's black budgets, their secret budgets, as the Senate Majority Leader. He is on the Defense Appropriations Appropriate Subcommittee, so he is the money man for the defense contractors. As far as the mob is concerned, Johnson's taking $55,000 under the table every month from the mob to protect their illegal gambling operations in Texas. Carlos Marcello, who is the boss of the mob, is a major financial supporter of Lyndon Johnson's. When Johnson becomes president, all of the organized crime wiretaps put in place by Attorney General Robert Kennedy are immediately terminated. So Johnson has a warm relationship with the mob. And as far as Texas Oil is concerned, Johnson's their water boy. He's carrying their water for the oil depletion allowance, and they are apoplectic about the possibility that it will be repealed. So Johnson is smart enough to see everyone's motive, and he is the linchpin of a plot which is necessarily centralized in Dallas. Dallas is where Johnson controls the police department. It's where he controls the Dallas County Sheriff's Office. It's where he controls the district attorney. So Dallas is his town. I make the case in this book that the actual shooter, at least one of the shooters, because I think there are multiple shooters, I do think the president is shot from the front and the back. I do think there is a shooter in the grassy knoll. 51 witnesses, eyewitnesses, agree with me. You won't find their testimony in the Warren Commission. But I think the shooter from the 6th floor Texas School Book Depository is Malcolm Wallace. Wallace's 14-point fingerprint, a fingerprint therefore admissible in a court of law in the United States, is found on a cardboard box in the sniper's nest on the 6th floor. He is a Marine marksman. He is a hitman. He is Lyndon Johnson's hitman. You read the book, I tie him to Johnson throughout his entire career. He is at least one of the shooters. I think that Madeline Duncan Brown, Johnson's mistress of 21 years, who accurately says on the evening of November 21st, Lyndon Johnson says to her, "After tomorrow, I won't have to put up with these Kennedy SOBs no more." Tells her the following morning, "After today, those Irish mafia bastards will never humiliate and embarrass me again." Madeline Brown is credible. She has visited the Del Charro resort owned by Kurt Murchison on the arm of Lyndon Johnson. She is recognized by the general manager there. She says that she and Johnson spent the night together in the Driscoll Hotel, New Year's Eve, 1964. And on that occasion, she says, "Lyndon, a lot of people said you had something to do with the assassination." He says, "No, it wasn't me. It was the CIA and those oil bastards." Well, he left one person out, himself. So I'm excited about this book. I think I make a very aggressive case that Johnson had the motive and the means, that he had unique relationships with others in the plot, and that he was, unlike the public image that the LBJ library portrays. They tell us that Johnson was a great president because he signed the Civil Rights Law. Lyndon Johnson was an amoral psychopath. He was a ruthless, vicious, vulgar, crude, vindictive, abusive, corrupt, manic depressive, swinging from deep depressions to wild outbursts of temper. He was a womanizer who fathered at least 3 illegitimate children. I name them in my book, with secretaries, and he was drunk most of the time. Secret Service agent quoted in my book says if he hadn't been President of the United States, he would have been committed to a mental institution. That's a Lyndon Johnson. We pay with our tax money about $3 million a year to the LBJ library to burnish the image of a guy who was in fact a serial murderer. In my book, I tie him to 8 murders. Murder to cover up vote theft in the 1948 Senate election, where he won by a fraudulent 87 votes. An amazing thing. 87 voters came in at the last minute. They all had the same handwriting. They voted in alphabetical order, and they all used the same ink. He was responsible for the murder of Henry Marshall. Henry Marshall was a U.S. Agriculture Department Inspector General who was looking into the corruption of Billy Sal Estes and Lyndon Johnson. He committed suicide, shot himself in the head with a bolt-action rifle 8 times. Suicide. At least that's what the Texas coroner said in a county controlled by Lyndon Johnson. 3 informants in the Billy Sal Estes case. In their case, somebody connected a garden hose to the back of a pickup truck, put the hose down their throats, and poisoned them with carbon monoxide poisoning. Obviously an accident. So I think I tie Johnson irrevocably to a series of murders. Murder was in his repertoire, and therefore it is not that great a leap to see that he would murder to avoid federal prison. He would murder to avoid the consequences. He took matters into his own hands. And then you've all seen the famous photograph of Johnson being sworn in on Air Force One with a distraught Jackie Kennedy standing there next to him. Here's the amazing thing. Under federal law, when the president dies, the vice president is automatically elevated. There's no need to take the oath of office. The oath of the office was superfluous. He did it to twist the knife in the Kennedys. He calls Bobby Kennedy and says, hey, look up that oath for me. I need to take the oath. I want you to look it up so I get the words right. The oath was unnecessary. So at this late date, by 2013, the Warren Commission is thoroughly discredited. I realize that the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Huffington Post are going to try to continue the cover-up, continue the whitewash, but there's too much modern technology now. So we know, for example, that voice stress analysis tells us that when Lee Harvey Oswald says, I didn't shoot anybody, I'm a patsy, he's telling the truth. When they say, Oswald, did you kill the president? He says, no, sir, I did not. The voice stress analysis shows he's telling the truth. The Dallas Police Department takes a paraffin test. It shows that Oswald hasn't fired a rifle that day. Those of you who have any experience shooting will understand. Impossible to get off 3 shots on a Mannlicher Carcano $14 Italian carbine in 6.5 seconds. Cannot be done. The finest Army marksman tried to duplicate that. Could not be done. We now know that there was a second rifle found on the 6th floor, a Mauser. 3 police officers testified to it. Then 2 of them recanted. The third one, Roger Craig, refuses to recant. So he ends up dead. There's really nobody with a straight face can tell it that the Warren Commission was legitimate. People say to me, well, how could you accuse these learned men, these respected men on the Warren Commission of a cover-up? Why would they do that? Here's why. Because Lyndon Johnson persuaded them that it was the Russians who killed Kennedy. And yes, we do have to cover up what really happened, because otherwise we will precipitate World War III. That the American people would demand retribution, and therefore you're preventing World War III. Go along with this fiction that it was Lee Harvey Oswald, that he was a communist, that he acted alone to avert World War III. Earl Warren and Senator Richard Russell and Hale Boggs, Gerald Ford, these people think that they are accommodating this for the good of the country, that the American people can't know what really happened because it's too dangerous. And that is why they act in the way that they do. The Warren Commission's a classic case of deciding first what happened and then cutting and pasting the evidence to try to fit. If a witness comes forward and they heard more than 3 shots, or they saw a man on the grassy knoll, or they saw a man in a station wagon with a Goldwater bumper sticker on it, get out with a rifle bag, you disregard that testimony. Any testimony that doesn't fit the preordained decisions, or I should say conclusions of the Warren Commission, is to be ignored. So this book is about truth. Now some people can say, okay, Stone, you're a lifelong conservative, you've been a Republican, now a libertarian. Isn't this just a partisan attack on Johnson and Kennedy because you don't like them? Well, I don't like them. I understand the politics of the day. I understand, for example, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy lovers will tell you, oh, he bravely faced down the Russians and they removed their missiles. No, he removed our strategically placed missiles from Turkey and Italy in return for a pledge from the Soviets to remove their missiles, which they never did. We never had on-site inspections. There's no evidence the missiles ever left. We didn't learn that for 40 years. JFK called Eisenhower, called Truman, called Hoover, briefed them on his negotiations. He forgot to mention the part about giving up our strategic missiles. So yes, I'm a partisan, but if you look at my book, I beat up a lot of Republicans. Let's take Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford is a prime mover in the cover-up. We learn in a 1992 declassified document that the FBI goes to Gerald Ford and they say, look, we have this minor problem. The autopsy shows a wound in Kennedy's upper back, and a wound in his upper back could not exit from the front, so Ford, in his own hand, in pencil, falsifies the autopsy record and moves the wound from the upper back to the lower neck. When the New York Times asked Gerald Ford about this in the 90s, He said, "I did it for clarity. The country needed clarity." You notice he didn't say the country needed truth. He said the country needed clarity. Again, this idea that we're covering up for the greater good of the country. So I think it's an exciting read. I have built on others because I had a unique relationship with President Richard Nixon. I had a unique relationship with Attorney General John Mitchell. I had a unique relationship with Ambassador Lodge. I had the opportunity to meet Fat Tony Salerno, the head of the Genovese mob in New York. I had an opportunity to question these men, and I think I have bolstered a lot of the existing literature. Nixon said to me specifically, the difference between Johnson and me was we both wanted to be president, but I wasn't willing to kill for it. Nixon is actually in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. In fact, 4 men who would be president are in Dallas that day: Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and we now know George H.W. Bush. Bush told us for 30 years he couldn't remember where he was that day. Did any adult not remember where they were the day Kennedy was killed? Only when declassified documents come out in '92 do we learn that he is in fact in Dallas in the morning and back in Dallas in the late afternoon. So Nixon was in Dallas that day. I'll tell the story to wrap up. He leaves Dallas as Kennedy is arriving. He flies to New York. He gets to the airport. He gets in a cab. He hears in the cab that the president has been shot. He gets to his apartment house. The doorman tells him, "Oh, Mr. Vice President, President Kennedy is dead." He goes to the telephone. He calls J. Edgar Hoover. He says, "Edgar, was it one of those right-wing nuts?" "No, Dick, it was a communist." "Really?" 37 minutes after Oswald has been detained, we already know he's a communist. Oswald, we now know, was a paid informant for the FBI. Ruby was a paid informant for the FBI. No wonder Hoover's in such a hurry to wrap this investigation up. We also know, even though both the CIA and the FBI denied to the Warren Commission any knowledge of Oswald, Oswald was indeed a CIA asset, had been part of a defective program, had been sent to the Soviet Union as a CIA agent. That's why he gets his citizenship back so quickly when he returns to the United States. So the Warren Commission is discredited in my view. Oswald is exactly what he says he is. He's a patsy. He's not even on the 6th floor when Malcolm Wallace shoots from the 6th floor depository building. It's very interesting to note that shortly that Wallace, at the time that he shot, was working for Temco, a defense contractor that is owned by a man named H.D. Byrd. H.D. Byrd is a major financier of Lyndon Johnson's career. H.D. Byrd is the founder of the Texas Civil Air Patrol, where Lee Harvey Oswald and David Ferry are members. But more importantly, H.D. Byrd owns the Texas School Book Depository building. He's also the cousin of Senator Harry Byrd, who oversees the committee that oversees the CIA. So the relationships here are extremely interesting. Anyway, I thank you all for coming. It is an extraordinary fight for truth. I don't expect the New York Times or the Washington Post to review my book. I wish they would. The fact that the Washington Post reviewed Philip Sheenan's terrific book last week is a breakthrough. It's the first time the Washington Post has ever acknowledged that there might be some question about the Warren Commission. Perhaps it's because the Grahams no longer own it, since the Graham family was very tight with the CIA. Phil Graham supported Lyndon Johnson for president in 1960 over John Kennedy. So we're moving towards an era of truth. The reason for that is because of the internet. See, in 1963, there were only 3 networks and a handful of national newspapers, and therefore, if the truth didn't appear there, it didn't appear anywhere. There was no way for people to learn. The internet has democratized our society, so people like me and others who have an alternative view of what happened in Dallas in 1963, they have a venue to exchange information, and that is valued. Final point, people say to me, okay, well, what's the point of this other than selling books? Yes, I want to sell books, so it's a great Christmas present. Please buy as many as you possibly can. And Lyndon Johnson is not going to be posthumously prosecuted for the murder of John Kennedy. But the bottom line is this: the government lies to us all the time. They're lying about Benghazi. They're lying to us about whether we can keep our health care program, our health care plan, whether we have our own doctor, the government lies to us. So if any American will now view what the government says more skeptically, then I will have achieved my goal. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
Why do you think Richard Nixon said something like he suspected LBJ?
Well, first of all, Nixon shared a lot of the same financiers. His career was also had benefited enormously from the largesse of Texas Oil. In the 1962 campaign, he had received substantial funds from Kurt Murchison. That's why I believe he actually does go to a reception at Murchison's house early in the evening on the 22nd. There's some confusion about that. Also, he is, in 1963, he's washed up. He's a joke. He's a national joke. He's considered finished. No one thinks that he has a political future. He has made an abysmal race for governor, and after that race, he is self-immolated with his famous last press conference, the anniversary of which, by the way, was the day before yesterday. And he still wants to be president. He still plots to be president. The other question, I get this question a lot, why didn't subsequent presidents raise some questions? Well, if they killed Kennedy, doesn't that mean that they could kill a subsequent president? I mean, there were attempts on the life of Truman, Ford, and Reagan. There were assassination attempts on all of them. So Nixon tried to get the CIA records on the Kennedy assassination. He requested them. He wanted them as his insurance policy, and he could never get his hands on them. It is interesting to note that even today, they will tell you probably saw this a month ago in the papers, they say, all the Nixon tapes have now been released. No. Any mention in the White House tapes of the CIA, the Bay of Pigs, or the Kennedy assassination is still redacted to this day for national security purposes. Another question. Yes, ma'am.
A couple of things, actually. I have a neighbor of mine who's 68. Her father worked in the hotel industry and was down in Dallas, working at the time LBJ was in the hotels, and said some of the things he overheard, the nastiness that he said when Kennedy was assassinated. The first thing she said her father said to her is, "This was LBJ did this," which was really interesting.
Yeah.
And then I'll link you to it on Twitter. A friend of mine who's a marksman and a hunter and went up to the window and wrote me a whole analysis of how there was no possible way with that gun.
Yeah, it cannot be done.
No, that it can't be done. It's a really interesting little analysis about why and how he missed the obvious kill shot to the head, and it was just, it doesn't make any sense.
Now, a number of people say to me, well, doesn't the fact that Governor John Connally, a protege of Johnson's administrative assistant when he was in the Senate, is in the car with Kennedy, why would Johnson put his own man at risk? In fact, we now know that LBJ goes to Kennedy's hotel room the morning of the assassination. He argues that Johnson should ride with him, and Senator Ralph Yarborough, who Johnson despises, should ride with the president in the death car. And JFK says absolutely not. And they have a shouting match. They end up shouting at each other. It's in Jackie Kennedy's memoirs. Connally insisted on the route through Dealey Plaza. Connally tells Jerry Bruno, the president's chief advance man, either we do it our way or you tell the president the invitation is rescinded, we don't want it. Governors don't talk to presidents that way. Done 13 presidential trips. They don't talk to governors don't talk to presidents that way. I don't think Connally is fully aware of what he's in on, otherwise he wouldn't have gotten in the car. But at one point, Senator George Smathers writes that Johnson actually was trying to convince JFK to let Jackie Kennedy ride with him and let the president ride with Yarborough. Needless to say, Kennedy rejected that idea as well. Another question. Yes, ma'am.
So do you believe Oswald was not involved at all? And if so, what was he doing there? And secondly, has anyone threatened you in writing this book?
Oswald is involved in the sense that he's a fall guy. He's been maneuvered there, in my opinion, by the agency. But the confusion that you see in his comments at the police station reflect the fact that it's just dawning on him what has happened. He is exactly what he says he is, a patsy. The CIA has maneuvered him there to take the blame. I think he's on the second floor. He's seen on the second floor 90 seconds after the shooting. The elevator, the electricity in the building has been turned off. That's never been explained. So the elevators are stuck. Some argue that he could have run down 4 flights of stairs, but when he's apprehended or when he's seen, he's not out of breath, he's not nonplussed, he's not upset, he doesn't seem to know what's going on. He's drinking Coca-Cola. Have I been threatened? Well, I understand the LBJ library is not happy. They're going to be less happy about my press conference outside the library on the 26th. I have a wanted poster that is much larger than this, and I'm going to lay out the case because I think people need to know. You know, you can't change, until you turn their heads, you can't change their hearts and minds. Terry.
What about home movies? It seems so unlikely that at that time there was really only 1 or 2 videos of films of what happened. Were there some other, movies that were taken and never?
There are some photographs. There are some still photographs that are taken. I would have to call them interesting but non-conclusive. I am among those who believe the Zapruder film is altered. It's interesting that the entire chain of evidence in the JFK assassination is violated again and again and again. The simplest police procedures that would allow for the successful prosecution of Oswald are violated. In fact, the evidentiary record is corrupted, and in some cases I think it's fabricated. But even Arlen Specter, a friend of mine who I fought with over martinis on this subject many, many times, would admit that there were some frames missing from Zapruder. That's in the book. He admitted that only grudgingly, I might add. Another question. Yes, sir.
I know you go through APIC, the button collectors, basically through the Facebook group.
Yes.
You may not know that since 2000 we've been doing interviews with people from all political parties about their campaigns in history. One person I interviewed was Al Haig, who told me a Kennedy assassination story. This doesn't fit with your theory, but I thought you might like to hear it. He claimed that a friend in the German government, after the 2 Germanys came back together, told him that they had found in the Stasi files a KGB document showing that Oswald had been trained by the KGB as an assassin.
Yeah.
I've never seen that before.
Actually, we know from a declassified document from 1992 that the Russians really feared that this was going to be pinned on them or their puppet state. So they conducted their own investigation, and they concluded that the killer was Lyndon Johnson. Jackie Kennedy goes to French intelligence. She can't get the time of day from American intelligence. She goes to French intelligence. Remember, Jackie Kennedy was the toast of Paris. She was a bourgeois. She went to the French intelligence. They produced a book which can still be found, a report, which they published in book form. It also says Lyndon Johnson is the perp. So, Jack Ruby specifically said if Adlai Stevenson had been vice president, this never would happen. Would have happened. Porter says, Jack, what are you saying? Ruby says, look at the man at the top. Look at the man who's in there now at the top. That's Lyndon Johnson. So Evelyn Lincoln, the president's secretary, tells us it's Lyndon Johnson. Jack Ruby tells us it's Lyndon Johnson. The KGB tells us it's Lyndon Johnson. French intelligence tells us it's Lyndon Johnson. E. Howard Hunt, who's a CIA asset, who I think helped sabotage Nixon in Watergate, it's also in the book, says that it's Johnson. The list goes on and on. It's an uphill battle for truth, but it's one that I'm willing to undertake. One more.
Along those lines, what's your view on Jesse Venture's show and Death at E. Howard Hunt?
Well, you have to take anything E. Howard Hunt says with some grain of salt because he is, after all, a CIA agent, and he is skilled in the arts of disinformation. But it's interesting that Jesse's new book, which I'm sure you can find in this store, really bolsters mine. They're really complementary. He has reached the same conclusions that I have regarding Lyndon Johnson and regarding Johnson's role. It is interesting, for example, that the district attorney, Henry Wade, shortly after Oswald is apprehended, he holds a press conference and he says, the president has been killed on the basis of a plot. We have arrested one man. We'll arrest the other conspirators and everyone will be brought to justice. Then he gets a call from Cliff Carter, an aide to President Johnson. Now he holds a new press conference. we've determined Oswald acted alone. There are no other conspirators. We're going to bring him to justice. So again, the control of Henry Wade. Specifically, Carter calls Wade before Air Force One leaves for Texas and says, the president says you are to charge Oswald with murder, a state crime. Do not charge him with conspiracy, a federal crime. Johnson wants no federal investigation. He wants initially a state investigation. Former President Nixon told me that former Supreme Court Justice Tom Clark told him that initially Johnson wanted Clark to head a state commission, a state version of the Warren Commission, and was talked out of it by his aides who say it won't wash. A state investigation is going to look like a whitewash. And Clark was not anxious to serve in any event. So it's interesting. Another question.
I have just one question, Mr.
Yes,
Stone.
this very good-looking red-headed woman who happens to be my sister.
Thank you. I had heard that you were going to make a movie. Is that true? The name of it was going to be Edge of Cantaloupe. You know anything about that?
No, that was the working title. I have the BBC has talked to me about making the book into a movie. We may do that. I think using black and white stills, it could be very, very powerful. But first things first. Let's get this book on the New York Times bestseller list, and then we'll talk about the movie. Thank you all very much for coming. Be happy to sign your books.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, while I shift some stuff around here, if we can just start lining up right in here, starting at the chairs. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, I'd be happy
Did you want to pose with him?
Yep, sure.
Okay. Oh, did you want to keep recording, or do you want me to take a still, sir? Do you want me to take a still photo, or to keep recording? Okay. All right.
Well, we can talk later or by email, but this is what I was talking about, the Association for Non-Kennedy Association of Truth.
Yep.
It's actually my computer office.
Yep.
It also doubles as
Very
and
cool.
And if you would be interested in being a board of directors.